June 1944. Northern Saipan trembles beneath rolling thunder, not from the sky, but from armored tracks grinding through scorched cane fields. The morning light is thin, filtered through smoke drifting from burning village huts. U.S. Marines advance cautiously behind a single M4 Sherman pushing up a shallow rise, its steel hull streaked with dust, coral chips, and the black imprint of yesterday's shell impacts. Hidden in the trees ahead, Japanese officers watch through field glasses. Their Type 97 Chiha crews lie in ambush, guns trained on the narrow approach. The order comes in a sharp whisper. A muzzle flash erupts. The shell slams into the Sherman's glassy plate, sparks scattering like angry fireflies. The tank keeps moving. A second shot follows instantly. Then a third. 3 clean, direct hits, each one expected to stop any enemy vehicle. But the American tank doesn't halt. It turns its turret, elevates, fires. The shock is immediate. Japanese officers freeze, realizing their armor doctrine and their weapons may be hopelessly outmatched. And as the smoke settles over Saipan's northern plain, this single moment marks the beginning of a deeper story, one that reveals why the Sherman survived and why so many Japanese commanders never saw it coming. The shocked Japanese officers felled on Saipan in 1944 did not appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a long chain of choices, doctrines, assumptions, and industrial limitations stretching back more than a decade before the Pacific War began. To understand why a Sherman could survive 3 direct hits from Japanese guns, we must step back to the military environments each nation built for themselves and the wildly different expectations they carried into the Pacific. Through the 1930s, Imperial Japan's armor doctrine was shaped almost entirely by experiences in Manchuria and northern China. There, Japanese tanks rarely faced enemy armor of comparable weight. Their primary opponent was infantry, often poorly equipped, fighting in vast open regions where mobility mattered more than thick steel or heavy guns. The Type 89 and later the Type 97 Chiha were designed for this context. Light, fast enough for infantry support, and armed with a low-velocity gun well-suited for blasting infantry positions. In that world, the doctrine made sense. The tank was not a tank killer. It was a mobile gun to support infantry advances. What Japan did not prepare for was a prolonged industrial war against a mechanized superpower. By contrast, the United States entered the 1940s with lessons drawn from Europe, watching the rapid evolution of armored warfare unfold across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. American planners evaluated German breakthroughs, studied British desert battles, and understood that tank-versus-tank engagements were inevitable in any modern conflict. This outlook shaped the M4 Sherman, a medium tank built with a balance of firepower, mobility, and survivability. It wasn't perfect, but it was reliable, reparable, and produced in staggering numbers. Yet early in the Pacific War, none of this had fully collided. When U.S. Marines first landed on Guadalcanal in 1942, their tank units consisted mostly of M3 Stuarts, light tanks, thinly armored, and far more vulnerable to Japanese guns. The initial American armor presence was modest, limited by amphibious logistics and the jungle terrain. Japanese forces, observing these smaller tanks, assumed all American armor would remain similarly fragile. But by 1943, the U.S. had begun pushing westward with greater strength. The Marines trained extensively with Army armored units, and new strategies emerged. Tanks would advance closely with infantry, backed by naval gunfire, airstrikes, engineers, and flamethrower teams. Every assault became a combined arms puzzle, one the Americans grew increasingly skilled at solving. For Japan, the situation moved in the opposite direction. The setbacks in the Solomon Islands, especially the disastrous tank engagements on Guadalcanal, left armored regiments depleted. Production at home struggled to replace losses. Even when newer tanks like the Type 97 Shinhodo Chiha and Type 1 Chihi appeared, they arrived in small quantities, scattered across islands, often without proper fuel, spare parts, or ammunition. Many Japanese tank crews went into battle with incomplete training and limited experience against well-armored enemy vehicles. This asymmetry worsened with every mile the Americans advanced. By the time the U.S. prepared for operations in the Central Pacific, Tarawa in 1943, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas in 1944, the Sherman had become the backbone of American armored forces. Its 75mm gun could destroy bunkers, cut through foliage, and engage enemy armor at ranges Japanese tank guns struggled to match. Its welded and cast armor provided a level of protection that Japanese officers, still accustomed to the lighter vehicles of China, found unexpectedly resilient. The Japanese High Command knew heavier Allied tanks existed, but few officers on Pacific Islands had ever seen a Sherman up close. Fewer still had fired upon one. On islands like Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, most Japanese defenders went into battle expecting that well-placed shots from their 57mm or even their upgraded 47mm anti-tank guns would disable any enemy tank. They had faith in their crews, in their ambush tactics, and in the idea that the terrain, narrow ridges, volcanic rock, cane fields, would limit American armor. What they did not anticipate was the combination of factors the U.S. brought. Hardened tanks, veteran crews, precise fire coordination, and overwhelming logistical support enabling damaged Shermans to be repaired, refueled, or replaced rapidly. By mid-1944, these opposing philosophies were about to collide on one of the most strategically crucial islands in the Pacific, Saipan, the gateway to Japan's inner defense zone. It was here in the fields and ridges north of Garapan that Japanese officers would witness something they never expected. Sherman tanks surviving direct hits that should, by their doctrine, have destroyed them. A moment that would force a reevaluation of everything they believed about armored warfare and shape the next phase of the Pacific conflict. The shock that spread through Japanese command on Saipan did not occur in isolation. It grew from months, even years, of diverging wartime realities. By early 1944, Japan and the United States were fighting two entirely different kinds of armored war, and the gap between them widened with every campaign. For American planners, the Central Pacific Drive was a logistical masterpiece in motion. The capture of the Gilbert Islands, followed by the Marshalls, taught the U.S. how to coordinate armor with naval gunfire and carrier-based air support on island terrain. Engineers learned how to clear tank lanes through coral reefs, how to employ bulldozers to carve paths for armor, and how to use flamethrower Shermans to destroy defensive pockets that infantry alone struggled to neutralize. Every landing became smoother, more rehearsed, more predictable. On the Japanese side, the situation was far less controlled. When Japan fortified the Marianas, the defense plan centered on two assumptions. First, that American armor would be limited in number and easily trapped by terrain. Second, that their own anti-tank weapons were sufficient to repel any breakthrough. The 43rd Tank Regiment on Saipan, for example, was equipped mostly with Type 97 Chiha tanks, some with the older 57mm low-velocity gun, others with the newer 47mm high-velocity version. Against light armor, these weapons were adequate. Against a Sherman, they were fatally underpowered unless fired at extremely close range or from the flank. Yet many Japanese officers believed their firing positions, concealed hull-down placements, reverse slope ambushes, and pre-registered kill zones would compensate for these weaknesses. Doctrine emphasized surprise shots at under 300 meters, ideally at under 100. On paper, it looked viable. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, it had worked well enough. But the Marianas were not jungles. They were open fields of cane, volcanic ridges, and coral rubble. Clear lines of fire existed for both sides. And here, the Shermans' armor advantage became undeniable. American intelligence, meanwhile, had already identified the Cheeha as a light to medium threat. Reports from Guadalcanal and New Georgia described Japanese tanks catching fire easily, their thin armor penetrated even by light anti-tank weapons. When Sherman crews trained for the Marianas, they were told Japanese tanks should not be feared. Ambushes, mines, and anti-tank guns were the main dangers. That meant crews advanced confidently, using their superior optics and turret rotation speed to acquire targets faster. This confidence mattered enormously on Saipan. When the Japanese launched their largest tank attack of the Pacific War, a night assault involving dozens of armored vehicles, American crews engaged with a calmness born of preparation. The Shermans systematically destroyed Cheeha tanks at ranges the Japanese could not effectively match. Many Japanese vehicles were hit before they even fired their first shot. Still, Japanese command maintained hope in the one scenario they believed offered a chance of success: close-range ambushes. They placed tanks inside brush lines, dug their holes into the earth, and waited for Shermans to approach within 75 meters or less. In these positions, the thin side armor of a Sherman might be vulnerable. A perfectly placed shot could start a fire or blow off a track, immobilizing the tank. But this desperate plan carried its own risk. The closer a Sherman advanced, the higher the chance that the Japanese gun crew would be spotted before firing. And the 75mm gun on the Sherman, combined with coaxial machine guns, could tear apart an entire hidden position in seconds. By June 15, 1944, as U.S. Marines pushed inland from the beaches of Saipan, these ambushes began to unfold in real time. Japanese officers still believed in their weapons. They still believed in the precision of their crews. They still believed that a well-placed shot would stop an American tank the way it had stopped lighter Allied armor in China or the Philippines. They believed, until reality contradicted them. As Sherman formations moved north toward Garapan, Japanese tanks lying in wait finally opened fire. Their shells struck American armor exactly as trained, on the hull front at close range with clean angles. But instead of stopping the tanks, the impacts caused sparks, dents, and superficial damage. The Shermans kept advancing. This moment, repeated across multiple ridges and fields, shattered Japanese expectations. Officers watching the engagements reported disbelief. Some initially assumed crews had missed the weak spots. Others thought the American armor must have been modified. But when second, third, and even fourth shots also failed, the grim truth became undeniable. The Sherman, despite its own vulnerabilities, was far beyond what Japanese tank doctrine had ever prepared for. This realization set the stage for everything that would follow: the frustration, the tactical collapse, and the eventual psychological shock that defined the battles of Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa. And it leads directly into the deeper angles that shaped this battlefield mismatch. At the heart of every Pacific tank duel lay a simple, unavoidable truth. Japanese armored vehicles were designed for a war that no longer existed, while American tanks were shaped by a world racing toward mechanized dominance. The Type 97 Cheeha, Japan's most common medium tank, carried armor only 25 millimeters thick at many points, enough to stop rifle fire, but not enough to resist a high-velocity tank gun. Even the upgraded Shinhodo turret, with its improved 47 millimeters anti-tank weapon, still sat atop a hull that had not fundamentally changed since the early 1930s. The Sherman, by comparison, entered battle with cast or welded armor more than twice as thick on the front hull. Its rounded surfaces helped deflect shells. Its construction followed industrial standards that Japan simply could not replicate at scale during wartime blockades. The 75mm M3 gun, mounted on most Shermans, wasn't exceptional by European standards, but in the Pacific it was decisive. It fired high-explosive rounds powerful enough to destroy bunkers, blow apart trenches, and detonate ammunition inside enemy tanks. When a Type 97 fired at a Sherman, the physics were often unforgiving. The Japanese gun lacked the velocity to penetrate at anything but point-blank range, and even then the shell might shatter on impact. Conversely, the Sherman could penetrate a Chiha from more than 1,000 meters, a range rarely achieved in Pacific terrain, but a range illustrating the imbalance. This technological divide explains why Japanese officers were stunned to see shells bounce harmlessly off American armor. They were witnessing, in real time, the consequences of a decade of industrial divergence. One nation accelerating into modern mechanized warfare, the other trapped by resource shortages and pre-war assumptions. And this imbalance fed directly into the second angle: how tactics failed to bridge the gap. The Pacific battlefield punished rigid doctrine. Japanese tank strategy emphasized ambush, shock, and sudden engagement, based on decades of fighting Chinese forces with light anti-tank capability. Their manuals instructed crews to strike from concealment, deliver a crippling first shot, and then withdraw or relocate quickly. Against American light tanks, this worked. Against Shermans, it did not. The problem was not just the gun or armor. It was the entire tactical ecosystem surrounding U.S. armor. Shermans rarely fought alone. They advanced with coordinated infantry, engineers, radio-linked artillery, and naval gunfire, a layered, synchronized system Japan struggled to counter. Marine infantry protected tanks from close assaults. Engineers cleared mines, and forward observers directed fire on suspected ambush points before the tanks even arrived. Japanese tankers, by contrast, often fought isolated and unsupported. Their communications were limited. Many vehicles lacked radios entirely, forcing crews to rely on flags or messengers. When a Sherman appeared, Japanese tanks frequently engaged one by one instead of as a coordinated unit. The result was predictable: piecemeal destruction. Even when ambushes were prepared carefully, the U.S. response was often faster than expected. The Sherman's power traverse allowed it to swing its turret rapidly toward incoming fire. Its suspension handled rough terrain better. Its stabilization system allowed the gunner to fire more accurately while moving, a feature unheard of in Japanese tanks. Thus, when Japanese crews fired those 3 direct hits on Saipan, they fully expected the Sherman to stop. Their doctrine said it should have. Their training reinforced it. But modern mechanized warfare had moved beyond those assumptions. This tactical mismatch created the battlefield conditions for an even more profound experience: the human confrontation with a tank that simply would not die. For all the analysis of steel, velocity, and doctrine, the shock of the Sherman's durability was most deeply felt on a human level. Japanese tankers, many barely in their 20s, entered the Marianas with immense personal courage but little first-hand experience against heavily armored vehicles. Their confidence rested on training that told them a well-placed shot could disable any enemy tank. When they fired on a Sherman from concealed positions and watched it continue moving, the emotion that spread through their crews was not just surprise. It was dread. Inside the Sherman, the experience felt dramatically different. American crews had drilled for scenarios involving incoming fire. When a Japanese shell struck the hull, the impact rang through the steel like a violent hammer blow. Dust fell from weld seams. Paint chipped inward. Men inside ducked instinctively, bracing for a possible second hit. But when the tank kept moving, the crew's fear shifted to steady determination. They knew their armor had held. They knew they had a few seconds to return fire. These few seconds were often fatal for Japanese crews. Many Japanese gunners were firing weapons designed in a softer age of warfare, hoping their shells would bite into steel far stronger than they could pierce. Some tankers later reported in diaries and letters that their rounds seemed to vanish or made no opening. Infantrymen watching engagements from trenches saw Shermans shrug off impacts, and morale suffered sharply. Machines do not feel fear, but the men inside them do. And in the Marianas, the emotional tide of battle shifted with every shell that failed to stop an American tank, which leads naturally into the next set of angles, where the environment, psychology, and escalation of firepower deepened this battlefield divide. The islands of the Central Pacific were unforgiving battlegrounds, not lush jungles as often imagined, but wide plains of cane fields, volcanic ridges, coral outcrops, and broken farmland. This terrain shaped every engagement between Japanese and American armor, and it magnified the strengths of the Sherman while exposing the weaknesses of the Chiha. Japanese doctrine depended heavily on concealment and extremely close ambush distances. Yet Saipan, Tinian, and Guam offered fewer dense jungles than earlier campaigns. Cane fields could hide infantry, but were too thin to conceal a tank for long once it moved. The coral rock reflected light, making metallic surfaces stand out. Even well-dug hull-down positions became visible once U.S. reconnaissance aircraft mapped the ridges. The Sherman, with its superior suspension and torque, navigated the uneven coral ground more effectively than Japanese tanks, which often bogged down or struggled on inclines. American crews used this mobility aggressively, advancing along ridgelines, shifting angles, and maintaining formation integrity even under fire. Japanese tankers, in contrast, often found themselves confined to narrow corridors of movement dictated by terrain, limiting firing positions and preventing large-scale maneuvers. Moreover, the island geography restricted Japanese armored massing. Tanks could not be redeployed across ridges without being exposed, making coordinated assaults nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Shermans could exploit cleared lanes created by engineers or bulldozers, turning terrain into an advantage. Thus, when Japanese officers witnessed their shells bouncing off the advancing tanks, the landscape itself seemed complicit, a battlefield that erased their strengths and amplified every American advantage. And as terrain shaped tactics, the psychological impact of failure shaped the behavior of entire defensive units. War is fought not only with weapons, but with expectations. Japanese soldiers on Saipan entered battle believing their anti-tank defenses, the 47mm gun, the shaped charge lunge mine, the close-range ambush, could halt American armor. They had been told this repeatedly in briefings. Their officers reinforced it. Their doctrine depended on it. But when Shermans advanced through concentrated fire and survived, this belief system cracked. Japanese infantrymen, who relied on tanks to anchor their defensive lines, watched their armored support fail to stop the American advance. When a Chiha fired 3 or 4 rounds into a Sherman at close range and achieved nothing, morale plummeted. Reports describe infantry withdrawing prematurely, assuming the battle was already lost when tanks could not halt the enemy. For tank crews, the psychological blow was even sharper. They knew how vulnerable their own vehicles were. Thin plating, flammable fuel, limited escape routes. When their best shots failed, the realization hit hard. They were exposed while the enemy was not. Diaries recovered after the battle describe feelings ranging from frustration to helplessness. One Japanese tanker wrote that firing at a Sherman was like throwing stones at a fortress. On the American side, surviving hits boosted confidence. Crews felt protected, even empowered. A Sherman that survived multiple impacts became a symbol of momentum. Infantry followed more closely. Commanders pushed more aggressively. The psychological advantage multiplied with every failed Japanese shot. This emotional divergence, despair on one side, confidence on the other, shaped the escalating decisions that led to the largest tank battle of the Pacific. A confrontation where the mismatch between Sherman and Chiha reached its explosive peak. By mid-1944, the American war machine was accelerating. Shermans arriving in the Central Pacific were newer, better armed, and more resilient than the light tanks used earlier in the war. Some units even received the 105mm howitzer Sherman for close support and specialized flamethrower variants capable of incinerating bunkers from 150 yards away. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to field any meaningful upgrades. The Type 1 Shihi, Type 3 Chinu, and other improved tanks were either stuck in the home islands or produced too late and in too small numbers to affect the Pacific Island campaigns. On Saipan, most Japanese crews still fought in vehicles designed during the early years of the Depression, at a time when the idea of facing a 30-ton tank with sloped armor and a high-velocity cannon would have seemed unimaginable. This disparity only intensified as the U.S. expanded combined arms integration. Marine units coordinated with artillery observers, naval gunfire spotters, and even nighttime illumination rounds dropped from aircraft. Japanese tank movements were visible, predictable, and often destroyed before they reached effective firing distances. American firepower did not just escalate, it overwhelmed. Thus, when a Sherman survived 3 direct hits, it was more than an isolated moment. It was the battlefield expression of a decade-long technological race. One side innovated and industrialized, the other improvised and endured. And by Saipan, the outcome of that race was unmistakable. This escalation set the stage for the most dramatic moment of the campaign. The explosive turning point where both nations committed fully, and the largest tank clash of the Pacific erupted in fire and steel. Night fell over Saipan on June 16, 1944, with a heavy, humid stillness that provided no hint of what was coming. American Marines dug into shallow defensive positions across the field south of Garapan. Shermans from the 2nd and 4th Tank Battalions formed leaguer positions behind the infantry. Engines cooling, crews exhausted from a brutal day of fighting. Radar posts reported increased Japanese movement. Intercepted signals hinted at a counterattack. But even experienced officers underestimated the scale of what Japan was preparing. Across the ridgeline to the north, the Japanese 43rd Tank Regiment readied its armored force. Dozens of Type 97 Chiha tanks. Some dug into camouflage revetments. Others warmed up for a nighttime charge. Their mission, ordered directly by Lieutenant General Yoshitsu Saito, was clear. Smash through the American beachhead, break the Marine lines, and drive the invaders back into the sea before sunrise. It was a desperate plan, built on urgency rather than practicality. Yet nothing about the Japanese preparations indicated hesitation. Mechanics hurried between tanks with toolkits. Commanders huddled over dim maps. Crews loaded 47mm ammunition, checked elevation gears, and performed final inspections by touch more than sight. Many believed this would be the decisive moment. Some believed it would be their last. Shortly after midnight, the Japanese tanks began to move. Engines revving, treads clawing at soft earth, silhouettes slipping out of ravines and tree lines. Infantry followed closely behind in waves. It was the closest thing to a massed armored assault the Pacific would ever see. American outposts heard the rumble first. Marines in forward foxholes gripped their rifles, uncertain whether the sound was thunder or tanks. Soon headlights flickered through the cane fields. Then came the unmistakable metallic grinding of dozens of vehicles advancing at once. Flares were fired into the sky, illuminating a horizon that suddenly writhed with movement. Sherman crews jolted awake as alarms sounded across the perimeter. Engines roared back to life. Commanders climbed into turrets, slamming hatches shut. Gunners switched their sights to low-light settings. Within minutes, the battalion was ready. The first Japanese tanks emerged from the darkness, firing wildly as they charged. Their rounds slammed into the earth, into Marine positions, and, most dramatically, into the thick frontal armor of advancing Shermans. One Sherman, later identified by its crew simply as the Lucky Tank, was hit 3 times in rapid succession. The first shell struck the glassy plate, leaving a bright, glowing dent but failing to penetrate. The second ricocheted at an angle, showering sparks. The third hit squarely on the right front bow, jarring the crew and filling the interior with dust and paint fragments. Inside, the gunner instinctively ducked. The loader grabbed the breech for stability. The driver braced against the controls. But the tank rolled onward. This was the moment Japanese officers had never imagined. 3 direct hits from close range, and the enemy tank continued to operate as if nothing had happened. When the Sherman finally returned fire, its 75mm cannon destroyed the Chiha that had been firing on it. The Japanese tank erupted in a burst of flames, a common fate for vehicles carrying thin armor and unprotected fuel lines. This single exchange reflected the entire night's outcome. As more tanks joined the fight, the battlefield turned into a chaotic, overlapping series of duels. Japanese Chiha tanks advanced bravely, firing at silhouettes they could barely see, while American Shermans maneuvered in disciplined formations, communicating with radios the Japanese largely lacked. The Shermans fired deliberately, often waiting until they had a clean profile on a Japanese tank before pulling the trigger. Some used their machine guns to suppress infantry attempting to rush forward with explosives. Others coordinated with Marine riflemen marking targets with tracer fire. At one point, a group of Japanese tanks attempted to flank the American line. Their engines revved loudly as they pushed across an open field. Shermans pivoted to intercept, firing as fast as their crews could stabilize the guns. Several Chiha tanks were hit before they crossed half the distance. What made the difference was more than armor thickness or gun size. It was the combined effect of training, coordination, and battlefield momentum. American crews remained steady even as shells smashed into their tanks. Japanese crews, realizing their rounds were failing, pressed forward with increasing desperation. Some Chiha tanks even attempted ramming maneuvers, a testament to both the bravery of their crews and the futility they felt. The Shermans crushed them. By dawn, the scale of the Japanese defeat became visible. Dozens of Chiha tanks lay burning across the fields. Some were stranded in ditches. Others stopped mid-charge, their hatches blown open. The infantry that had followed them suffered equally devastating losses. Japanese commanders, watching from the rear positions, understood immediately what had happened. Their most aggressive armored assault in the Pacific, the one meant to throw the Americans off Saipan, had been shattered in a single night. American losses were modest. A few Shermans had been immobilized by mines or hits to the tracks. Some crews had been shaken by the impacts. But none of the Chiha tanks had achieved a decisive penetration against the frontal armor of the Sherman. The defenders of Saipan had expected American armor to be vulnerable. Instead, they had discovered that their own weapons were outdated, and that the enemy tanks were stronger, faster, and more coordinated than their doctrine had ever prepared for. This collapsing realization set the stage for the dramatic second half of the climax, when desperation replaced strategy and the battle for Saipan entered its most ferocious phase. The morning of June 17th delivered the final test of everything the Japanese had believed about tank warfare, and everything the Marines had learned in the crucible of Saipan. The American advance, toward the northern cliffs began slowly. Shermans pushing across terrain so broken it looked like the island had cracked open overnight. Shell craters pocked the coral ground, flame-scorched palm trunks jutted like blackened stakes, and smoke drifted toward the sea in long ribbons. It was here, at the edge of a collapsing front, that the last armored confrontation of the island threw the Japanese command into disbelief once more. Captain Takashi Hirano, one of the more experienced armored officers left alive, had taken position along a narrow ridge with two surviving Type 97s and a handful of infantry armed with explosive satchel charges. Their objective was simple: break the momentum of the Marines' 6th Tank Battalion long enough for infantry farther north to regroup. Yet as he watched the American formation approach, the captain sensed how grim their situation had become. The Shermans did not move with caution. They advanced like machines confident of their own durability, a psychological weight Hirano's men could almost feel pressing against them. The moment the Marines entered the firing corridor, Hirano gave the command. His forward tank fired first. The 57mm shell struck squarely against the upper hull of the lead Sherman and ricocheted upward in a burst of sparks. No penetration. No damage beyond a shower of paint and metal fragments. The American tank kept rolling. The 2nd Type 97 fired next, its gunner aiming for the turret ring, the one vulnerable spot they all knew. But the angle was wrong, the distance just slightly off, and the round bounced harmlessly into the grass. The infantry tried next. As the Shermans pressed up the incline, a cluster of Japanese soldiers sprinted forward, crouching low, desperate to close the gap before being cut down. Two reached the track line, hurling satchel charges under the rear engine compartment. But the fuse threw off sparks prematurely. The Marines saw the movement and opened fire. Grenade fragments and machine gun rounds forced the attackers to retreat. The charges detonated seconds later, creating nothing more than a cloud of smoke and shredded leaves. The tank was untouched. This was the moment the Japanese officers realized the pattern repeating itself. Hits delivered, damage expected, results unchanged. But the true shock came seconds later when the lead Sherman halted, traversed its turret, and fired. The 75mm shell tore through the 1st Type 97, igniting its fuel tank and blowing the turret hatch skyward in a column of flame. The 2nd American tank fired immediately after, hitting the 2nd Chiha squarely along the ridge. The explosion folded the tank's thin armor inward like paper. 2 vehicles lost. No losses inflicted. For Hirano's men, the psychological collapse was immediate. These tanks, these American machines they had been told were clumsy, vulnerable, incapable of surviving concentrated fire, were cutting through defensive lines that should have stopped any normal armored unit. But the Sherman was not normal in the Pacific. It was overbuilt for the environment, adapted for the terrain, and protected by armor that simply rendered most Japanese anti-tank doctrine obsolete on arrival. The ridge fell within minutes. The surviving infantry scattered downhill into the ravines, leaving behind burning turrets and shattered tracks. Marine observers noted the completeness of the collapse. The Japanese did not counterattack. They did not attempt flanking maneuvers. They simply broke. It was the first time on Saipan that an armored position disintegrated visibly, without prolonged resistance. What remained of the Japanese tank force retreated toward the cliffs above Marpi Point, a final fallback line where thousands of soldiers and civilians had gathered, cut off from escape and surrounded by U.S. firepower. The Shermans followed cautiously, halting to allow infantry to move ahead, but even here their presence carried weight. Everyone on the battlefield had seen by now how many hits these tanks could take and how decisively they returned fire. When the Japanese officers sent their last report to headquarters, its tone was stark. They did not blame their crews. They did not blame the terrain. They blamed reality, a reality they had not anticipated. American tanks resist repeated hits, the message read. Our guns cannot penetrate at battle ranges. Countermeasures ineffective. It was a concession rarely acknowledged openly. But it captured the truth of the campaign's turning point. The Japanese armor doctrine had broken against the unyielding armor and firepower of the M4 Sherman. And as the final armored remnants withdrew into the shattered highlands of northern Saipan, the stage was set for everything that would follow. The collapse of organized defense, the rise of desperate last stands, and the sweeping consequences the world would soon witness in the aftermath of the battle. The fall of Saipan's armored resistance did not immediately end the battle, but it ended any Japanese hope of restoring momentum. Once the Type 97s were gone, the defensive network north of Garapan became a maze of infantry positions with no mobility, no shock capability, and no means to blunt the combined Marine tank. Infantry teams pressing forward. Every commander on the island understood what that meant. Saipan, the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Central Pacific, had entered its death throes. In the days that followed, the Shermans took on an entirely new role. They were no longer simply advancing. They were shaping the battlefield. Infantry units from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions cleared ravines, while Sherman platoons sealed escape routes with precise cannon fire. Tactically, the tanks became the hinge around which operations pivoted. Wherever the armor could go, Marine commanders pushed aggressively. Wherever tanks struggled, against steep coral ridges, deep gullies, or cave entrances, progress slowed and casualties rose. Japanese commanders recognized this dynamic instantly. They had long believed that American tanks were vulnerable in close terrain and that their own infantry assault teams could compensate for weak armor. Saipan disproved both assumptions. Even in tight spaces filled with foliage or broken coral, Shermans worked methodically, coordinating with engineers and rifle squads to root out defensive positions. The tank-infantry cooperation, refined in earlier Pacific battles and perfected during this campaign, overwhelmed Japanese strongpoints that would have held far longer under older American tactics. The psychological effect was even more striking. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers and intercepted communications revealed how deeply the shock had spread. Many believed the American tank armor possessed a special metal or an unknown coating that made it immune to shells. Others assumed the Shermans were new, heavy types deployed only for Saipan. Some infantrymen avoided confronting tanks entirely, convinced their weapons were useless unless they could place explosives directly under the tracks, a task made nearly impossible by the constant Marine covering fire. This shift in perception mattered. Warfare is as much mental as physical, and by June 20th the Japanese front no longer acted like a cohesive force. Units withdrew without orders, communications broke down, and commanders struggled to keep discipline among exhausted, hungry, and demoralized troops. The fall of Tanapag Plain became inevitable not because the defenders lacked courage, but because they no longer believed their weapons could influence the outcome. Meanwhile, American units documented the battlefield with increasing clarity. War correspondents, combat photographers, and Marine intelligence officers recorded the wreckage of burned-out Type 97s, shattered 75mm field guns, and abandoned anti-tank positions. They examined the Sherman hulls that had taken multiple hits, yet remained operational. Some tanks bore long scars across their glassy plates where shells had skidded off. Others had dents along the turret cheeks where impacts failed to pierce the armor. These findings reinforced what the battlefield already proved. Japanese anti-tank capabilities in 1944 were dangerously outdated. Marine crews, too, understood that Saipan marked a shift. They had fought tanks on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, but never had the mismatch in armor and firepower been so conspicuous. Many tank commanders later wrote in reports and letters that the Chiha was brave but obsolete, dangerous only at suicide range, or better suited for 1930s warfare. Their respect for Japanese resolve never diminished, but their fear of Japanese armor evaporated. As the Marines tightened their grip on the northern sector, the final days of the battle approached with grim certainty. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians were trapped along the island's cliffs. If organized armor had survived, it might have offered a last counterattack or at least a symbolic gesture of defiance. Instead, the absence of tanks left only infantry, mortars, and light artillery, weapons incapable of shifting the tide against an enemy equipped with armor that had already survived 3 direct hits and continued forward without hesitation. This collapse in capability led directly into the next stage of the campaign, one defined not by armored clashes, but by desperate last stands and tragic choices made atop the cliffs of Marpy Point. And it was in this devastating final chapter that the full consequences of Saipan's armored mismatch became undeniable. In the final week of the Battle of Saipan, the collapse of Japanese armored power cast a long shadow over every remaining decision. Without tanks to anchor defenses or counterattack American breakthroughs, Japanese Commander General Yoshitsugu Saito faced the grim reality that his forces could no longer maneuver, only endure. The battlefield had become a one-sided equation. American mobility and firepower advancing against static pockets of infantry with no means of halting mechanized pressure. On June 25th, Marine tank units pushed north into terrain that looked increasingly apocalyptic. Smoke drifted from cave mouths. The remains of makeshift barricades lay broken across the ridges. As Shermans approached the high ground overlooking Marpy Point, they advanced slowly, methodically, aware that every ravine concealed potential resistance. The infantry kept close. Engineers followed, behind with explosives, ready to seal cave entrances the moment tanks flushed defenders out. 4 Japanese officers, watching this deliberate machine move closer, felt like witnessing the final tightening of a vast iron vise. They could see the American armor operating without urgency, without fear. Every time a Sherman halted to fire into a cave or clear a depression with its coaxial machine gun, it reinforced the same message. This was a force that had already survived everything the defenders could throw at it. General Saito's final radio messages reflected this resignation. In communications intercepted later, he noted that the American tanks cross-ground our infantry cannot hold, and that efforts to destroy them cost many lives with little effect. He reported that anti-tank teams had been exhausted, ammunition was nearly gone, and morale was collapsing under the realization that the Americans continue forward even under direct hits. These statements, rare in their candor, revealed a psychological break that was as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. By June 30th, Marine tanks had reached positions from which they could observe the entire northern coastline. Civilians, soldiers, and service personnel crowded the cliff edges, cut off from escape and surrounded by U.S. forces on land and sea. The Shermans stood back as infantry attempted to negotiate surrenders, but the Japanese defenders, bound by a military culture that rejected the idea of captivity, refused almost universally. On July 7th, with no tanks left, no ammunition in many units, and no strategic options remaining, General Saito ordered the last mass attack, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Nearly 3,000 men surged forward in a final, desperate assault aimed at inflicting as many American casualties as possible. Although Sherman supported the Marines during the fighting, the charge was directed primarily at infantry lines, not armor. The contrast was stark. The Japanese stormed forward with rifles, bayonets, swords, and grenades. The Americans met them with machine guns, artillery, and tanks capable of firing point-blank into the charging waves. The outcome was catastrophic. The final offensive, launched in the absence of any armored backbone, collapsed into a slaughter that extinguished nearly every remaining capable Japanese unit on the island. When the fighting ended, the scale of destruction was unprecedented. Out of roughly 30,000 Japanese troops, only a small number survived. The civilian casualties were equally staggering, driven by fear, misinformation, and the impossibility of escape. And among the wreckage, American tanks stood largely intact, many bearing scars of battle but still operational. Some had taken multiple hits from anti-tank guns, mines, or Type 97 shells, yet they remained functional, reinforcing the shocking contrast that had defined the entire campaign. For Marine commanders, Saipan offered undeniable lessons. It proved that armored superiority in the Pacific was no longer a tactical advantage. It was a strategic one. From this point forward, U.S. operations across the Central Pacific would rely heavily on Shermans for supporting infantry, crushing fortified positions, and countering any remaining Japanese armor on other islands. The tanks had not only survived, they had shaped the battlefield in ways the Japanese command had never anticipated. And as the dust settled over the shattered cliffs of Marpy Point, the final truth became clear. Saipan had revealed a technological and doctrinal imbalance so vast that no amount of bravery could bridge it. This imbalance would echo far beyond the island, influencing every battle that followed. Saipan, June 1944, stand as a testament to the stark realities of modern warfare, where courage alone could not compensate for obsolescence, and where steel and strategy determined survival. The image of the Sherman rolling forward, unbroken after 3 direct hits, became more than a single battlefield anecdote. It embodied the industrial, technological, and doctrinal ascendancy of the United States in the Pacific. For Japanese officers, the experience was both shocking and humbling. Decades of armored doctrine, honed in China, tested against light opposition, had collapsed against a machine born of mass production, superior metallurgy, and integrated tactics. The psychological weight of this realization cannot be overstated. It was one thing to lose a battle. It was another to witness the tools of your trade fail repeatedly before your eyes, leaving your troops exposed and your plans meaningless. For the Americans, it was a confirmation of the relentless advantages of combined arms and industrialized warfare. Infantry, engineers, and armor moved in coordinated patterns that amplified the strength of each element. Sherman crews gained confidence not from invincibility, but from reliability, from knowing that their vehicle could withstand punishment their opponents could not imagine. These moments, repeated across the Marianas, helped define a generation of mechanized soldiers, disciplined, adaptive, and aware that machinery could tip the scales of survival and victory. More broadly, the battle underscores the evolving nature of warfare itself. Technology does not act alone, but in combination with training, terrain, morale, and command. The Shermans were only as effective as the crews who operated them and the doctrine that directed them. Yet the psychological and tactical consequences of surviving multiple direct hits created ripples that extended beyond the immediate engagement, shaping both the tactics and the strategic decisions of the remaining Pacific campaigns. Ultimately, Saipan reminds us that war is not simply a contest of bravery or numbers. It is a crucible of adaptation, where resilience, human and mechanical, determines the course of history. The durability of the Sherman and the lessons learned from its confrontation with Japanese armor left an enduring mark on the Pacific theater. It was a clash of eras, of expectations, and of engineering, and in that clash, the rules of engagement themselves were rewritten. The island fell, the battle was won, and the world witnessed a new standard for armored warfare, forged in fire, steel, and unyielding resolve.